June 4th, 1942, Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The morning sun had barely risen when the horizon erupted in fire and steel. The roar of engines, the scream of diving bombers, and the thunder of exploding ordnance shattered the endless blue. High above the waves, courage clashed with destiny. Only 6 months earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore. Victory after victory. The rising sun ruled the Pacific. But on this small speck of coral in the middle of the ocean, the tide of war was about to turn. The Japanese Navy had come to finish what it started. The Americans had come to survive. Neither side knew this battle would decide the fate of the Pacific and perhaps the entire Second World War. In the next 4 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy would face a disaster so total, so shocking, that it would never recover. And it all began with a secret, a code, and a handful of men who refused to surrender. This is the story of Midway, where intelligence met courage, and where America rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to shatter the empire that once ruled the seas. December 7th, 1941, a date burned into American memory. The skies over Pearl Harbor filled with the whine of Japanese dive bombers and the thunder of explosions that turned calm waters into infernos. Battleships lay shattered, men perished in the flames, and the United States Navy, once a symbol of strength, seemed broken beyond repair. In the months that followed, Japan moved like a storm across the Pacific. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, all fell in quick succession. The rising sun stretched from Burma to the edges of the Pacific, an empire unchallenged, confident that its mastery of the sea was complete. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a machine of precision, its pilots veterans, its admirals proud of their invincible fleet of carriers and battleships. But beneath the shock and mourning in America, something fierce was awakening. What Japan had misjudged was not the strength of America's Navy. It was the strength of its resolve. In secret hangars, broken aircraft were rebuilt. Shipyards worked around the clock. New carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, emerged from dry docks faster than anyone believed possible. And in an unremarkable room in Hawaii, far from the roar of the engines and the crash of the sea, a handful of intelligence officers led by Commander Joseph Rockefort were at work. Surrounded by radio intercepts, static, and the cryptic chatter of Japanese communications, they labored endlessly to break the enemy's codes. The Japanese believed their plans were hidden. They weren't. The Americans had already begun to see through the fog. The codebreakers discovered something unusual. Repeated mentions of a target referred to only as AF. It was a mystery, a puzzle that could reveal Japan's next move. Rockefort and his men suspected AF meant Midway, a tiny atoll northwest of Hawaii. But they needed proof. They devised a trap, sending a false radio message claiming that Midway's water filtration plant had broken down. Within hours, Japanese communications confirmed that AF is short on water. The secret was out. The trap was set. In that moment, America held an advantage it had never known before: foresight. For the first time in the war, they knew exactly where Japan would strike. But knowledge alone couldn't win a battle. The Americans would still have to face a fleet that had never been defeated, in a fight that would test every ounce of courage, strategy, and sacrifice they had left. The ocean was vast, the stakes immeasurable, and in those early days of June 1942, both sides began moving toward a collision that would decide the fate of the Pacific. By late May 1942, the Pacific was no longer quiet. Hidden beneath the calm waves, the greatest naval confrontation in history was forming. Japan's mighty WWII, the same carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was on the move again. Led by the experienced Admiral Isuke Yamamoto and his striking commander Chuchi Nagumo, the plan was simple: lure the remnants of the American fleet into the open, crush them, and secure Japan's dominance once and for all. Their target was Midway Atoll, a small coral island barely visible on a map, yet crucially placed between Asia and the American mainland. Japan intended to seize it as a forward base, a stepping stone to Hawaii, and perhaps even the west coast of the United States. Confident in their secrecy, the Japanese fleet moved silently across the Pacific, unaware that their every step was being watched. Far to the east, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had already made his move. The broken pieces of America's Navy were gathering at Pearl Harbor. 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were being prepared for battle. Engineers worked day and night, welding, patching, and rebuilding what bombs had torn apart at Coral Sea. Yorktown had been expected to take months to repair. She was battle-ready in 72 hours. Nimitz's strategy was bold, almost reckless. Knowing Japan believed the American fleet was too crippled to fight, he would use their overconfidence against them. Instead of defending from behind Midway, he would wait in ambush. Carriers positioned northeast of the island, invisible against the horizon. On June 3rd, long-range American patrols spotted the first signs of Japan's invasion force. The trap was closing. Japanese planes struck Midway at dawn, filling the sky with smoke and fire. The defenders fought fiercely, Marine pilots launching into the chaos against overwhelming odds. Many never returned. But while the Japanese focused on destroying the island's defenses, they didn't realize what waited beyond the clouds. 3 American carriers hidden in the vastness of the sea. As reports poured in and radar screens flickered, Admiral Nimitz and his commanders made their choice. It was time to strike. Orders rippled across the decks. Aircraft crews sprinted to their planes. Torpedoes were armed. Engines roared to life. The air smelled of fuel, salt, and fear. The Battle of Midway had begun. High above the Pacific, destiny was taking shape. One side believed it was invincible. The other, fighting with courage born from loss, was about to prove that even giants could fall. Morning of June 4th, 1942. The Pacific lay calm, deceptive, almost peaceful, as the first rays of sunlight touched the waves. But within minutes, that peace shattered. From Midway Island, squadrons of American bombers took off into the rising sun, engines roaring, hearts pounding. Their orders were simple: find the enemy fleet and destroy it. They flew low and fast, searching across hundreds of miles of ocean. Below them, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed forward in perfect formation, their decks filled with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the next strike on Midway. The Imperial Navy was confident, almost careless. Their scouts had found no sign of American carriers. Victory seemed certain, but the Americans were already closing in. The first to attack were Midway-based bombers, lumbering through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Their aim was poor, their planes outdated, but their courage was unmatched. They dove again and again into the inferno, drawing Japanese fighters away from their carriers. Not a single bomb struck its target, but they bought time that would prove priceless. Then came the torpedo squadrons. From the decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the first waves of torpedo bombers thundered into the air. They knew the odds: slow, underarmed planes flying low over open water, facing swarms of elite Zero fighters. Still they went. Squadron after squadron pressed their attacks, torpedoes skimming the waves toward their targets. One by one, they were cut down. Entire squadrons vanished in the sea of fire. Of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, every plane was destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating alone in the wreckage, forced to watch the battle unfold. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Their doomed attacks pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the skies above momentarily unguarded. At that precise moment, the American dive bombers arrived, unseen, unexpected, and perfectly timed. From 20,000 feet, they rolled into their dives, sun glinting off their wings as they screamed toward the carriers below. Bomb bay doors opened. Seconds later, the ocean exploded with fire. Kaga took multiple direct hits, her decks erupting in fuel-fed infernos. Akagi, the pride of Japan, was struck dead center, flames engulfing her flight deck, trapping hundreds below. Soryu followed, consumed by explosions that tore her apart. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were ablaze. The men of the Japanese Navy, who only hours before believed themselves unstoppable, now watched in disbelief as their fleet turned into a floating graveyard. Above the smoke, the American pilots pulled away, hearts racing, fuel low, the enormity of what they'd done sinking in. The impossible had happened. In a single morning, the balance of the Pacific War had shifted forever. The Pacific burned. By mid-morning on June 4th, 1942, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were crippled and sinking, columns of black smoke marking their graves. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in chaos. Yet the battle was far from over. One carrier still lived, Hiryu, the lone survivor of Japan's once mighty strike force. Her decks were slick with oil and blood, her crew exhausted, but her spirit unbroken. Admiral Yamaguchi Taman refused to retreat. "We will strike back," he ordered, and within minutes, Hiryu's flight deck thundered to life once again. 2 waves of dive bombers took off, heading straight for the heart of the American fleet. Their first target was the USS Yorktown, already battle-scarred from the Coral Sea. Lookouts spotted the incoming planes just moments before they attacked. Sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft guns roared. The sky erupted with flak and tracer fire as Japanese bombers dove through a storm of metal. The first bomb struck amidships, tearing through Yorktown's decks. Fire spread rapidly. Then came a second hit, an explosion so powerful it knocked men off their feet. Within minutes, the proud carrier was burning, listing heavily, smoke pouring from her hull. Still, her crew refused to abandon ship. They fought the fires with everything they had, buckets, hoses, bare hands, and somehow, miraculously, they saved her. Yorktown lived for a moment. The second wave came hours later. This time, they weren't bombers, they were torpedo planes. Diving low beneath the smoke, they released their deadly cargo. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's side, the explosions tearing open her hull. Power failed. The ship slowed, then stopped. The order finally came: abandon ship. As sailors slid into the oil-slick water, they turned to watch their carrier, their home, lean slowly to port and begin to die. Yorktown had taken everything the enemy could throw and still stood long enough for her sacrifice to matter. But while Japan celebrated the sinking of Yorktown, they didn't know their fate had already been sealed. American scouts had spotted Hiryu. Her location was radioed back, and the remaining dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet were on their way. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath them, smoke still drifting on the wind, the sun sinking low in the west. Then, out of the haze, they saw her, the last of Japan's carriers, alone in the vast Pacific. Without hesitation, they attacked. Hiryu's gunners fought bravely, filling the air with fire. But the bombers came fast and true. 1, 2, 3, then 4 bombs struck home. The carrier's deck erupted in flames, her planes destroyed before they could launch again. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship. He stood on the burning bridge as the inferno consumed her, a final salute to an empire that was beginning to fall. As night descended on June 4th, the sea glowed with fire. 4 Japanese carriers, the heart of the WWII, were gone. In a single day, Japan had lost the very force that had carried it to dominance. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, not gradually, but in one blazing instant. When the fires of battle finally dimmed over the Pacific, the ocean was littered with twisted metal, oil slicks, and the silent shapes of ships slipping beneath the waves. The Battle of Midway was over. The echoes of gunfire faded into the wind, replaced by the quiet sound of survivors clinging to life amid the wreckage of 2 great fleets. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic. 4 carriers, over 300 aircraft, and more than 3,000 sailors and airmen gone in a single day. These were not just ships or planes. They were the heart and soul of Japan's naval power, the same men who had led the charge at Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for months. The pride of the Imperial Navy was gone, and with it, the illusion of invincibility. For America, the cost was heavy, too. The USS Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, and hundreds of brave pilots and sailors were lost. Many who had survived Pearl Harbor fell at Midway. Proof that victory never comes without sacrifice. But in that sacrifice, something profound was born: hope. The men who fought at Midway weren't seasoned warriors. Many were young, barely trained, thrust into a war that seemed unwinnable. Yet, they stood their ground against overwhelming odds and turned the tide of history. Their courage was not forged in confidence, but in desperation, a defiance of fear itself. Admiral Chester Nimitz, upon hearing the final reports, said it best. It was close as it could be, but it was enough. Midway was not just a victory of ships and planes. It was a victory of intelligence, bravery, and timing. America had matched Japan's might not with greater numbers, but with smarter strategy and unbreakable resolve. It was proof that even after the darkest day, after Pearl Harbor's devastation, a nation could rise again. Across Japan, the news spread slowly, almost unthinkably. The loss was hidden from the public for months, censored to protect morale. But inside the halls of Tokyo's Naval Command, the truth was undeniable. Japan would never again regain the offensive. From that day forward, Japan would fight not to conquer, but to survive. And for America, Midway was more than revenge. It was redemption. The Pacific, once dominated by the rising sun, now shimmered with the first light of hope. The tide had turned, but the war was far from over. The smoke of battle drifted away, carried by the winds of the Pacific. Beneath the waves, the remains of 4 Japanese carriers lay entombed: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, silent monuments to an empire that had reached too far. The ocean that once echoed with the roar of their planes was now calm, indifferent, eternal. For Japan, Midway was more than a defeat. It was the breaking of the sword. The heart of its carrier fleet was gone, and with it, the ability to strike far across the ocean. The pilots lost at Midway were irreplaceable. The most skilled men of the Imperial Navy, veterans trained in a system that could not produce replacements fast enough. What remained of Japan's air power would never again match its former glory. For the United States, Midway became a symbol of what could be achieved through courage, intelligence, and unity. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, a nation still grieving had dealt a mortal blow to its enemy. Shipyards roared to life, factories worked day and night, and new carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Lexington, were already rising from the docks. The tide of war was shifting, and this time it flowed toward victory. But beyond the numbers and the strategies, there was something deeper: the human spirit. The young pilots who never returned, the sailors who fought fires with their bare hands, the code-breakers who worked unseen in dark rooms. They were the reason the Pacific was saved. The Battle of Midway stands as one of history's greatest turnarounds, a moment when fate itself seemed to hesitate, caught between despair and triumph. From that day on, the question was no longer if the Allies would win, but when. Decades later, as historians looked back on the battle, they saw not just ships and statistics, but the echo of something timeless: the power of resilience. Because sometimes, all it takes to change the course of history is the will to keep fighting when everything seems lost. And that is the legacy of Midway, a victory not of luck, but of faith, intelligence, and sacrifice. Hit that like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more epic stories of history's turning points.